Our gospel message today comes from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Soon afterward, he went to the town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. And he approached the gate to the town. A man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. During our first confirmation session this year, I began with a monologue. Confirmation is a time where we can explore faith and look into Scripture, learn about Jesus, church history, and the local church. Already everyone looked bored, me included. So I added, we also learned about things like human sacrifice and cannibalism and zombies at the end of the world. Everyone looked up, puzzled and amazed and enthusiastic. Now I admit that this is kind of a shameless hook for the confirmation class, though it is fairly accurate. Christians in the first century were accused of cannibalism for eating their own God during the Eucharistic feast. And there are stories of human sacrifice with the story of Abraham and Isaac, and even allusions in Jesus. But our gospel story is an interesting one today, one that talks about zombies, or the dead becoming undead. So Jesus and his motley crew are approaching the town in Nain, where they meet a funeral procession. Jesus raises the dead body, and everyone is struck with fear, noting a great prophet has risen among us. Now, if we had more time to study this scripture in Bible study, we would explore some of the incredibly interesting things that Mark is doing here as a writer of literature. We would talk in depth about how the idea of the dead coming back to life was an important concept in the collective consciousness of the Israelite people in the first century. We would talk about how he uses this story as an allusion to the actions of Israel's greatest prophet Elijah, who performed a similar miracle. We'd also talk about how Luke so beautifully includes this story just before John the Baptist's disciples come and question Jesus about his identity. By the way, Jesus responds to his disciples later on in this chapter by saying, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." Perhaps if we lived in a different time where our own lives of faith were more closed, we would simply take this story as it is, simply a miracle. The dead are raised. But if you're like me, I suspect that you read this story and really get stuck on the whole dead becoming undead thing. For a moment, however, I ask that you suspend your need to verify the facticity of this resurrection story so we can look at it a little bit closer. Now, Luke is not very big on showing Jesus' compassionate side in his ministry. If you're looking for compassion in Jesus, look to Mark, because Mark shows Jesus as this very compassionate person. But Luke, not really. Luke's Jesus is a very good teacher. Luke's Jesus performs a lot of miracles. But you don't really see Jesus doing so out of compassion. But the story here, notice where the compassion is pointed to. The compassion of Jesus is not pointed to the person who has died, but to the widow, to the mother. Now, if you're a widow in the time of Jesus, you depended on support of your male children or other male relatives in the family. In our story, the only means of support for the widow, her son, has died. So when it says that Jesus had compassion on her, we should think of the fullness of this statement. Not only did Jesus have a pastoral concern for this woman, because she had lost a son, she had lost a child, but he also felt the loss that almost all but guaranteed that she would end up destitute, with no one to support her. So when Jesus walks up to the bier and touches it and tells the young man to rise up, this request isn't flippant. There's more than literary symmetry going on here in Luke. In other words, Luke isn't simply making an interesting point to keep the story going. And he's not simply playing on the collective consciousness of the Israelite people. And he's not simply setting us up for the big resurrection that comes later on. For in this story we find in the person of Jesus a God who is inherently compassionate and concerned for the welfare of this very particular woman. This compassion and this concern is so great, not even death can stop it. You know, we've become very good at compartmentalizing the various ministries of the Church of Christ. One of these ministries is the prophetic role. Often this prophetic role is described as stances that the church takes. We lift up the concerns of the poor in our prayers. We speak out against violence and intolerance. We talk about the importance of being environmentally minded. The prophetic voice calls us to a new way of thinking. But Luke's prophet, and indeed many of the prophets in Scripture, do more than speak. They act. So that when we clean up beaches or feed the hungry or raise money for a wellspring or make Christmas possible for the kids at Plumber Home for Boys, we are living out a prophetic ministry of the church. The prophetic role that we take on is not only in word and stance on social issues, but in the deeds and practices and action. Actions based on the very real concept of compassion for others. So when we hear our peanut gallery and our gospel message today say, God has looked favorably on his people, it is with this act of compassion they speak to. Notice that Jesus doesn't say much. This isn't really a teaching moment. He's not proclaiming with words some eternal truth. He simply raises the dead. And if we as the church, if we are individuals, if we want to know that God has looked favorably upon us, we will need to practice resurrection, or practice a compassion so deep that people around us stop to wonder where it has come from. And this week, The Atlantic published an article about stress and belief systems. The article states the problem. There's plenty of anecdotal and even some neurological evidence that a strong belief system helps religious people deal with adversity. Do members of the world's third most popular faith, that is, no faith, seek comparable secular comfort in times of hardship? So there was a study done by Oxford University which interviewed 100 non-religious rowers, like boat rowers, before practice and then before a big regatta. They asked the rowers to rate their stress level and how much they agreed with statements like, "The scientific method is the only reliable path to knowledge," and "In a demon-haunted world, science is a candle in the dark." Rowers pre-regatta were naturally under greater stress than those pre-practice, and also agreed more with the statements about science. The authors of this study concluded that it is not so much that what we believe in, so long as we have something to turn to in times of hardship. So let's come back to the question of resurrection. Was the young man at Nain really resurrected? There's a part of my brain that says, you've got to be kidding. There must be some natural or reasonable explanation for all of this. Maybe he wasn't really dead. Maybe the story was made up to make Jesus look good. But if I speak from faith, I proclaim with the peanut gallery, God has indeed looked favorably on us. Words echoed in our psalm reading today. And I can be thankful. Whatever we believe in, I believe we are better to believe in the resurrection born out of true compassion for others. I believe that we are called to practice resurrection when we are confronted with the needs of the world. And practicing resurrection is the prophetic calling of the church to bring the dead back to life, to bring the destitute back to good standing, and to care for those around us. Can we get there by other means? Perhaps. But we lose something beautiful when we leave out the resurrection. My brain cannot always fully accept the reality of resurrection. It can get me to accept this undying truth. God's compassion is greater than even death.